Much appreciate people coming out on a kind of a stormy day. Luckily, the snow and ice didn't turn out to be nearly what was expected, but I know it still affected some people's travel plans. I drove to Blacksburg today. It was a little slushy up in that area near Christiansburg. So thank you all very much for coming out. It's a great pleasure to introduce today's lecture series. Before I introduce today's speaker, I just want to remind everybody this is the Virginia Tech Carilion Research Institute Maurice Strauss Distinguished Public Lecture Series. And we're very honored to have Mr. Maurice Strauss here, and Steve, and the other family members as well. Dory, okay. And Oz. And Oz is, last time Oz came to a seminar here, I remember he barked at a particular slide. I don't remember what, remember? Yeah, so we'll see if he likes the data. Anyway, we especially want to thank the Strausses, Maurice Strauss in particular, for endowing this lectureship program. It gives back in so many ways to the community in terms of culture, scientific communication, engaging the whole community, and it's just indicative of all the other things the Strausses have done over the years. So we really appreciate it. Thank you, Maury, very much for this. It's really a tremendous thing for the whole community. And before I get on the introduction, I just want to give a little preview of the next upcoming talk. It'll be 2 weeks from this evening, same time, same station on November 29th. And we have Dr. Carla Schatz, who will be speaking then. Carla is the director of the BioX program at Stanford University. She's the Provostian professor at Stanford University. And she's a leading researcher in brain development and brain disorders throughout the lifespan. She'll be speaking about some exciting new insights into Alzheimer's disease. So that will be 2 weeks from this evening. Okay, without further ado, it's my great pleasure to introduce our guest tonight, Dr. Peter Rosenbaum. Dr. Rosenbaum is a professor of pediatrics and in the Faculty of Health Sciences at McMaster University and also at the McMaster Children's Hospital. He has served previously as the director of the McMaster Child Health Research Institute and also as the Canada Research Chair in Childhood Disabilities. Dr. Rosenbaum did his medical training and undergraduate work at McGill University, and from there he did his residency in Toronto at the Hospital for Sick Children. And after that, he served as a research fellow at the Wolfson Center at the Institute for Child Health at the University of London. And from there, he was invited to join the McMaster University faculty, where he's been for the years since that time. Dr. Rosenbaum is extremely well known in his field, which is, of course, the field of child development disabilities, and particularly disorders such as cerebral palsy. His research has contributed on numerous fronts for which he's received lots of recognition. I just mentioned one or two things. He's a fellow and has received the Lifetime Achievement Award of the American Academy of Cerebral Palsy and Developmental Medicine. The Pediatric Chairs of Canada gave him the Clinical Investigator Award. He also serves as a fellow of that group. And he's a fellow of the Association of Child Psychology and Psychiatry, the Society for Developmental Pediatrics, and the Canadian Pediatric Society. He's also received an Advocacy Award from the Association of Children's Rehabilitation Services, which I think speaks not only to his medical and clinical and research practice, but his extreme involvement and engagement with the community and outreach, and really making a difference in people's lives in so many ways that a lot of researchers and clinicians don't often get to do because they're so caught up in the rest of it. He seems to find a way to make all of that happen. He has published over 300 peer-review publications, a really prolific record of publication, over 25 book chapters. He has made major advances and contributions to classifying systems for cerebral palsy in quantitative and rigorous ways so investigators and clinicians can communicate about what they're studying. He has studied children's attitudes towards disabled peers and family members and others' attitudes and how they interact to give insights on how caregivers and family members and those with disabilities can interact with each other in a positive way. He has done numerous studies and contributed to understanding of the quality of life for adolescents with cerebral palsy and also for families of children with a variety of other chronic conditions. One of the important things amongst many that he's done is develop and validated the communication function classification system for people with cerebral palsy, a very useful instrument for that. And he's also given us important insights to understand how to improve the participation of children, adolescents with physical disabilities such as cerebral palsy by focusing on a few things. In particular, active leisure, mobility, school, and socialization. And that, again, has opened up lots of windows and avenues for giving quality care to these folks. The physical and psychosocial health of caregivers is another important part of his studies and information that he's provided through his research, and how that actually impacts the well-being of children with developmental disabilities as well. And one of the things that I picked up on in reading a lot of his work that just drove the whole message home for me is this issue that he's addressed in so much of his work on mobility. When we think about people with a variety of neurodevelopmental disorders, and cerebral palsy is a good example, when you listen, as he does, and talk to those with these conditions like CP, what you find is one of the most important things is centered around mobility. When you think about the time and the planning and the effort that has to go into just planning your day or your activities and so forth, that most people take for granted and really don't give a second thought to. He has used very critical ways of analyzing that, and as I said, listening to those with cerebral palsy about what their life is like, and incorporating that in the body knowledge and the way that we can actually reach out and help. So I think you can see he's made multiple major contributions, and we are extremely fortunate to have him here tonight. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Peter Rosenbaum.
Boy, that's a hard act to follow. Thank you very much, Michael, and thank you to everybody for being here. So far, nobody has blamed Canada for the weather, and I'd like to thank you, because if you watch weather forecasts when you're in places like New York and Boston, they always show the cold weather coming from Canada. I plead innocent, at least for that particular situation. So it's a real pleasure to be here. It's been an absolute whirlwind day. I have learned so much. This is a quite remarkable place, and I would love to spend a whole lot more time than I'm able to do at this stage. So thank you very much to Michael. Thank you to Stephanie, who is responsible, I think, for nominating me. And thank you very much to Mr. Strauss for investing in your community in this way. I have never lectured in front of a dog before, and I realize there's a lot of pressure on me to avoid being barked at. Okay, so I want to give you a very brief bit of background. I'm a developmental pediatrician. That means a pediatrician whose interest is in children whose development is challenged in any of a number of ways. And the focus of our interest is obviously on what it is that's interfering with their development. But beyond that, what's the impact on the child of having differences in development? And how can we try to help parents, help kids to become as fully active and capable as they want to be in the face of conditions that we can't yet cure. I'm a health services researcher and a clinician, as you've heard, and I've been in the field for a very long time. I started when I was 4, so that's why I still look so young. But what's important is that with the perspective of years, one is able to look back and see just what an amazing change, or what amazing changes there have been and are in our field. And that gives me a lot of hope that we can do things even better. So what I want to do is to talk a little bit about where we've been and where I think we're heading when we talk about disability. And I won't go into a lot of detailed research, but I can support most of what I'm saying with research evidence, whether it's ours or somebody else's. So this is going to be more of a colloquial kind of overview than it is going to be a talk with statistics. So I want to do 3 things. I want to talk about what's changing in the world around us as far as health is concerned. And I think that's important because it's very easy for professionals to feel that anything that's happening is happening in a bubble we've created. And I think we do have some contributions to make, professionals like the people I've worked with today. But we have to see that in the context of a much bigger picture of what's changing around us. I want to talk about what's changing in the field of what I'm calling, in quotations, developmental disability. And I like to think of the field I'm in as applied child development. And anybody in this room who ever took a course in child development and learned and forgot and learned and forgot and learned and forgot the milestones will know how dreary and boring and almost useless milestones are. But when we work with kids whose development is different, we have to think about what it is that's different about it. What should a child of, or what typically would a child of that age and stage be doing, and how can we empower the child, and how can we help the family to empower the child to do those things? And that's when one really begins to think about child development, and it becomes quite fun. And then I want to talk about how I think all of this is influencing our field, and clearly I would like to have some discussion. I'm not shy about questions, and when I lecture to audiences, I always say that I need your questions to challenge me so that I can figure out what I've said that doesn't make sense, try to answer what you're asking, and learn from those questions. So the pressure's on you too. So let's talk about health. And this is an interesting notion, that health is the ability to adapt and self-manage in the face of social, physical, and emotional challenges. That's a very broad view of health. It clearly takes us far beyond the organic and the physical and mental components of our lives. But I think you'll see, or I will try to help you see, why this is so relevant to our work with children with impairments. So we think about functioning then, however it is done, and I want to emphasize this probably several times. We don't have to do things beautifully. If we can do things in ways that are useful to us, then we can think of that as evidence of health. So I often ask, how many people here play tennis? Okay, how many people play professionally? Why the hell do you bother? And that's almost always the response, thank you very much for being so polite. And why that's important as a silly annoyance is to remind us that we can do things in ways that we want to. We may not be good at them. Some of you may be taking tennis lessons because you want to get better. Some of you don't care how you play. It's just an excuse on Saturday to go out and bash a ball and sweat and have an excuse to have a beer with some friends. It doesn't matter why you play, and it doesn't matter that you're fabulously good at it or not. And I say this in the context of our traditions in the field of developmental disability and intervention, that we have tried to get kids to do things nicely and normally. And I think that's a tyranny, and I'm going to say more about it as we go along. So the emphasis then on the ability, on ability and adaptation and self-management means that we can think much more broadly about what it is we're trying to do to help people with impairments and to help families of kids with impairments to enable their kids to do things however they want to, in the best way possible, which is not to say we throw out to emphasize the importance of therapy, not to say we don't do therapy, but therapy and advice that we're giving are meant to be offered in the context of enhancing capability in ways that are meaningful to that person and that family. So I think it's really important, this actually came up today, the importance of Dr. Google. I've already diagnosed myself on the internet, I'm only here for a second opinion. And you know, I think it's funny, but this was a cartoon from about 10 or 15 or 13 years ago, and it's much funnier now than it was then, because Dr. Google's only gotten bigger and fancier. And as we've talked about, the problem with Google, the advantages of Google are unquestioned. The problem for a parent is that when they look up their child's condition, they don't find anything that is specific to their child. They find things that are about the condition. And so even though Dr. Google is there, people still come to us. And I ask students and residents, why do people even bother to come to doctors anymore? Because they want some individualization and some individual flavor of understanding to what it is, about what it is that's affecting their child. And so Dr. Google is open 24 hours a day, and everyone has access to the information. And I always ask parents what websites they looked at the other day before they came in to see me. Because I want to know, not because it's a challenge, but I want to know what they're looking at, how they're thinking about what they're seeing, what questions do they have, so that we can be on the same page. I can potentially be helpful to them in interpreting what they've seen, but it's important to know that the parent who says, I never look at Google, is a parent who needs to be asked again, I know you don't, but what did you look at yesterday? And so there's lots of information out there. Some of it's true, and some of it's not true, and some of it's snake oil, and we need to understand that. So the question for us as health professionals in the clinic is, how can we be helpful in the context of Google? And I think things are even worse these days. Those who already self-diagnose their symptoms on Google and just want a second opinion, please check Yahoo. I just think that it's important that we recognize that these things are there, and they are part of the fabric of modern life. I want to talk about the World Health Organization. Because I think there's some very important influences that some of us use every day, and I want to show you how these ideas have evolved. In 1980, the World Health Organization published the International Classification of Impairments, Disabilities, and Handicaps. And it was conceptually useful because, as you see, and I think there is a pointer, but anyway, you see that any disease, and you can put in here diabetes or cerebral palsy or Alzheimer's or glaucoma, has manifestations in impairments. There's something in our body that isn't quite right, which in turn are likely to interfere with our functioning, called disability, and sadly are going to have social consequences. So the utility of this framework is that it reminded us of these components, these manifestations of a health condition. But at the same time, as you see, there's an inexorable progression from disease to handicap. And the language is obviously pretty unpleasant in today's world. So this set of ideas was around for about 20 years, never really caught on as much as it should have. Many of us used it because it was conceptually more useful than just the diagnosis. But in 2001, the World Health Organization, with a lot of input from a lot of people with impairments, came up with a modification of this called the International Classification of Functioning, Disability, and Health, or the ICF. How many people in this room, this will not be on the exam, how many people actually know what the ICF is? 1, 2, boy, that's good. Okay, that's better than average. And here it is. And what I'm going to talk a little bit about this, because what I want to go on to talk about is based upon this framework. This framework evolved, as I said, from the 1980 version. And now you see that any health condition, and because I work with kids, I put CP and autism, but again, you can put diabetes or Alzheimer's, has manifestations in body structure and function, which may interfere with activity or doing things, which may interfere with participation, which is engagement in activities that are meaningful to the person. And by the way, we now formally are expected to pay attention to environmental factors, of which there are many: physical, obviously, attitudinal, personal, financial, legal, etc. And personal factors. What floats your boat? If you come in to see me and I can see from the door that you have cerebral palsy, I can obviously start offering treatment, or I can say, what do you need? And what's important to you? And so all of these elements are there in a way that now demands our attention. I'll make the quick comment that in medicine, doctors and others who make diagnoses are expected to listen to the story, look at the examination information, and rule out, is it this, or is it this, or is it this? To come down to a focus on what the diagnosis is, which is really important for me with my chest pain, or really important for me with my sudden onset of abdominal pain. It's only going to be one of a few things, so I'm suddenly having this kind of a problem, and making the diagnosis is extremely important, please, because it may be life-saving, the treatment may be life-saving, and there's often a very specific treatment to go with this particular diagnosis or that one. So that's the rule-out approach. This I think of as the rule-in. In other words, yes, I'm having a heart attack, which is probably the problem with body structure and function, and that's interfering with my activity, which is standing here talking to you when I've got terrible chest pain, and that's going to interfere with my participation right now. But what are the other factors that are important in the treatment and the rehabilitation and so on? So this is, I think, a very important way of thinking about health. And we like it because it's a framework for health for everybody. It does not apply just to people with disabilities or heart attacks. The words are now neutral. So we're now talking about activity and participation instead of disability and handicap. And everything is connected to everything else. So unlike the linear connections that I showed you earlier with the arrows going from left to right on the way to handicap, now we have a set of interconnected pieces. And one of the implications for this is that we can start anywhere and everywhere in our interventions. We don't have to start by giving you lots of treatment for your body structure and function problem. That may be appropriate, but that needn't be the only thing, and it needn't be the first thing. The other thing is that this is a dynamic system of interconnected parts, and so what I just said about where we start is much less important than it used to be. The biomedical approach was make the diagnosis, start the treatment. Oh, gee, we don't really have much to offer to people with cerebral palsy or people with intellectual disability or people with autism. It's really too bad, we're awfully sorry. And that was much of our traditional view. And so people thought that those of us who work in this field must be terribly dedicated. And then they'd say very gently, but what can you do for them? And heaven forbid anybody asks me, they get an answer. And so this framework, I think, allows us to expand the answer and to show the many, many ways and the many entry points for intervention. This is also a focus on what people can do. And that's really important because our traditional approach has been the catalog of doom. We make the diagnosis of a developmental impairment and we tell parents, stupidly in my opinion, what their child won't be able to do. And I always say there are two reasons not to listen to that. Number one is because doctors aren't nearly as good at predicting as they pretend to be. Otherwise, we'd all be incredibly good investors. And doctors apparently are notoriously bad investors. But the second reason is that kids don't listen. And kids who weren't supposed to walk and talk and think and learn walk in with their college degree and say, remember me? Just thought I'd say hello. So it's a focus on strengths. It's a focus on family strengths as well, and I'll say more about that in a minute. We also need to recognize that the field in which we work of developmental disability is about conditions rather than diseases. If somebody, and so we have a disease care program for lots of conditions, and I celebrate all of that. None of this is meant to be dismissive of anything else, or to say that what we do is more important. None of it is to diss any of the best of our medical care. If you have a kidney problem and renal failure, you can have dialysis. If you're lucky, you can have a transplant, and that may be curative. And we should clearly do that whenever we can. But in our field, much of what we're talking about are not diseases like kidney disease. They're conditions. Cerebral palsy is not a particular and specific disease. Autism is not a specific disease. Intellectual disability is a description of people's challenges in learning. Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, despite the capital letters, refers to aspects of behavior and challenges in paying attention. And all of these conditions have a whole host of things underneath the surface that may be the biological reason for the problem. But we pretend, by putting capital letters on, that these things are actual diseases, and we treat them the way we treat my heart attack, by trying to do all the diagnoses we can and find the right treatment. And that's, oops, sorry, I shouldn't have done that, should I?
Hit the bottom button.
Hit the bottom. Oh, there it is, okay. So as I said, we have an alphabet soup of diagnoses, which are really descriptive letters. And I love this phrase. A colleague in Minneapolis talks about these as adjectives parading as nouns. And the reason I put Asperger's at the bottom is I just read a biography, a very disturbing biography of Asperger, who was famous for describing, or what became a description of a particular form of autism. And when he started talking about this in the 1930s, he talked about autism, he talked about autistic with a small a. It was a description. It's like saying somebody's blonde or somebody's tall. It was a descriptive word. And eventually it got a capital letter and became a disease. And it's important to remember that these are not diseases that should be thought about in the same way as chest pain or as renal failure. What else is changing in our field, and you'll see the 1975, shows you how quickly things change sometimes. People have been talking about the non-categorical way of thinking. Now that's jargon. Diagnoses are categories. And a non-categorical approach reminds us that in addition to whatever the particular disease is, there are a lot of things, or condition is, there are a lot of things across conditions, that are common. And there's good research evidence to support this idea that within a group of people who have cerebral palsy or autism or intellectual disability, the variation within that set of that condition is much bigger than the common themes across them. So if you're a child with any of these labels or many others, you are likely to be facing a whole host of challenges with respect to your day-to-day life, with respect to your accommodation in school, whether you're being teased, and so on and so on and so on, how your future is being thought about. If you're the parent of a child with any of these conditions, you face common concerns. Yes, they're specific about spasticity with cerebral palsy and learning with intellectual disability, but all of you, as parents of those children, are having to deal with lots of things that I never had to deal with as a parent of typically developing kids. My kids were busy, but they were doing things that we all chose to do. I didn't have to go to see the neurologist and the epilepsy specialist and the special education teacher and on and on and on. And so all of these realities that are imposed on families with these children are common across the conditions. And why that's important is that we need to think about development, and development of children and of families. We work in the field of developmental disability and then immediately forget the first word and focus on the disability part. But what these kids have in common and what these families have in common are challenges in the typical and relatively, I emphasize relatively, easy development of typical kids. The other thing that we're realizing, and it's embarrassing to say this at my age, is we've come to recognize that children with autism, cerebral palsy, intellectual disability, and so on grow up and become adults with autism, cerebral palsy, and so on. And the adult world is not nearly as forgiving or as integrated or as organized to serve the needs of adults who used to be children with these conditions. And this is a really big challenge for all of us. And it's a huge challenge, obviously, for families. It's a challenge for us because we have responsibilities, having helped these, or tried to help these families over the years, to hope that as they age out of our systems, they will find a comfortable home somewhere else. And sadly, that doesn't happen. And this is one of the frontiers for our field. So what's changing in our field? I think it's really important to think about diversity and variation. And get rid of the word normal. How many people in this room are normal? Okay, so we've got a bunch of one. Okay. We've got one normal person and a bunch of abnormals. Isn't that a stupid way of talking? I mean, even if you think about gender, it used to be there were men and women, or boys and girls, and now even that is bigger than it used to be. And, whatever your political views or your social views on that, that is an example of our increasing understanding of the variation in life. And I like to just remind us that we celebrate variation in music. I happen to be a huge fan of the Goldberg Variations by Bach. In painting, in literature, we have huge interest in variations in ways of looking at things. And so I just took, darn it, clumsy son of a gun. So now I've really messed it up. Let me see. Where is it?
On the slideshow with the mouse and picture. Let's see.
How many adults does it help? Does it take to help somebody give a lecture? Thank you.
Is that it?
All right. I'm going to use the arrow. So, this is just an example of Monet and his haystacks. It's just, we recognize this in everyday life, but we're still stuck on normal and abnormal. And I think normal is a really dumb idea. How many people here are left-handed? Okay, I want to make sure the left-handers put their left hand up. Okay. Yes. Amazing how often you see this, Were you forced to change or expected to change? They attempted to. They hadn't reckoned with you. Okay. That's another, example of ordinary day-to-day life variation that now has many advantages. If you're an athlete, it certainly has advantages. If you're a musician, it may have advantage. If you're a pianist who has a really strong left hand, you have better control over the bass line of the piano, like Glenn Gould did, who was left-handed, by the way, as is my wife. So I just think it's important for us to think beyond the notion of the tyranny of normal. So what's all this got to do with childhood disability? Well, if we look at the ICF framework, we can think about some implications of how this might work for families. So here we are again. You've seen this, and I want to then ask you what you see. And I think what we see in general, depends upon what we're looking for and what we've been told to look for. So let me show you this picture of this beautiful young woman with a feather hat, right? Can you see her? Where's the... Okay, so here's the woman, and here's her eyelid, and here's her hair, there's her feather looking out over her right shoulder. Can anyone see the old woman? Many of you know this picture, and it's a famous trompe-l'oeil, as the French call it, an eye trick. But I think if you're conditioned to see things in a certain way, that's what you see. So let me show you the F-words in childhood disability, which you now see grafted onto the International Classification of Functioning framework. And I'll tell you the story about this in a minute. But what we've done here in what was initially a tongue-in-cheek throwaway idea called the F-words in childhood disability, I swear this is how we should think. This paper's just gone crazy over the last 6 years. But what we wanted to do was to give people ideas about how to put into practice particular ideas. These are not by any means the only ideas, but ideas about the ICF framework. So we're talking about fitness, and we talk about fitness because many kids, typical and kids with impairments, are less fit than they could be. But we don't think about fitness when we're thinking about other aspects of a child with an impairment. Activity, and you'll notice that it says function. It doesn't say nice function, normal function, pretty function. It says function. We talk about participation, and we emphasize friendships because one of the challenges that kids with impairments face is having fewer friends. A really big challenge. Personal factors. What's fun for you? Again, what floats your boat? And environment, and we emphasize family because remarkably, after 45 years of being at McMaster, I have never, ever had a 3-year-old come into clinic on her own and say, "Doc, you gotta help me, my behavior sucks." I don't talk good. Who do we see? We see families. It is parents who come to us and present their concerns to us. And so we need to think quite self-evidently about family as the unit of interest and not just the child. The child clearly is important, We put future in here at the bottom because the green arrow is outside of the ICF framework. The ICF framework allows me to think about your situation at today and to put in what are the elements that are there today, but there's not a time dimension to this. So we can, if you come back in 6 months, we can do this again and we can see what's changed. But we put future in because it's really important to remember that children are in the process of being, becoming, and belonging. And we need to remember that children are a work in progress. And, I think lots of people haven't thought about it this way. The impact of this paper has been, it's been downloaded 12 or 13,000 times from the journal's website. The ideas that I'll show you in this picture, this is a poster that was done a couple of years ago, and it was done for World Cerebral Palsy Day by colleagues in Australia who worked with us and with the parents we work with to make sure that the cartoons were reflecting their ideas. And this has been translated into at least 25 languages by people who found it and asked permission to translate it, and the answer always is yes. So if you need it in Amharic or Farsi or the Georgian language or whatever, let me know, because we have these, and these are all on our website and are downloadable for free. But what we've done recently is to put these ideas and these cartoons into the ICF framework, because although we develop these ideas with the ICF in mind, other people, if I just go back for a minute, people say, well, what about this F word and that F word and so on? And you've left out my favorite F word, whatever it is. And I'm not asking you. And what we then began to realize is we can, if a specific example was feelings. Where do feelings fit? Well, you can put feelings into lots of places within this framework. But by putting it back into the ICF framework, we're now contextualizing very explicitly how our ideas about the operationalization of this framework for health fit within the World Health Organization. And because we've had people ask us, we also have, this is equally relevant for adults, and people have asked us, can we use this in adult rehab and in adult disability? And the answer, of course, is yes, because these are non-denominational in every respect. So let me quickly emphasize a few things. The central role of family, and I've already talked about this a little bit, but this has implications for what we do in the clinic. And that means that we have to be family-centered. We have to be treating the parent as the world's expert on their child. We have to be taking advantage of the parent's thousands and thousands of hours of observation and perspective on their child and learn from them. Because as good as we are, we're in the clinic, they see the child in all sorts of other situations. And so we've done a lot of work and teaching about family-centered service, what it means, what it looks like. And there's good research evidence to show that when parents perceive that the services they are receiving are more family-centered, they are more satisfied with services, they have better mental health, and they have less stress. And my father used to say, why the hell do you need research for this? And I can answer that if you want. So this is, and increasingly, we are recognizing the importance of family engagement, so that in the United Kingdom, there's the James Lind Alliance, which is an alliance that expects, if you're going to get funding, that you engage with families as partners. PCORI, as you will know, in the States, and the SPORES in Canada, this strategic patient-oriented research, there's an increasing expectation of nothing about us without us. And that has to be formal, not just token. With respect to body structure and function, I think we're recognizing that many of our treatments and therapies, done with the best of intentions and with the best of current understanding in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, don't actually work the way we expected them to. That's very disappointing. People think you just have to talk louder or do more therapy. But in fact, much of this has been studied to death. And I put the Palmer study in here at the bottom just to point out that there are times when we do a study and we're disappointed by what we don't find, or the things we thought would work don't work, and we don't look at what else happened. And the Palmer study, which is a very well done randomized clinical trial published, as you see, 30 years ago, looked at interventions that included either physical therapy done in the best way possible at the time based on the current understanding, or an infant development program. And this is with children aged 12 to 19 months with cerebral palsy. And at 6 months, the children receiving the infant development intervention were doing better. And at 12 months, they were doing even better. And people said, oh, gee, the therapy didn't work. They didn't look at the other half of the page to say, what the hell's going on here? How come these kids are doing so well? And I think that's a really important example of just seeing what we're planning, what we're expecting to see, being disappointed by what didn't happen, and not recognizing what else might be going on. Now, a major focus of the ICF framework is participation. And participation in WHO terms is engagement in life in ways that are meaningful to you. So we have somebody here who walks less well than the rest of us and uses a wheelchair. He's here participating. We have people here wearing glasses who are participating despite a vision impairment, and on and on and on. And I just point these out frivolously in a way to remind us that we don't have to do things in a typical or ordinary way. There are even people here who are left-handed, which is really quite distressing to me. But we've let them in because it's Be Nice to Left-Handers Week. So now we're putting so much more emphasis on whether people are being able to engage in life in ways that are meaningful to them, and trying to understand, if they aren't, what are the barriers that might be limiting that from happening, and what can we do to reduce those barriers? What can we do to promote capability in the face of impairment? And we're talking more and more about family development. Anybody here who's a parent will know that you're a different parent when your kid's 10 than when they were 6 or 2. And that's partly because our kids are bringing us up, and partly because we are learning with experience. And we don't pay nearly enough attention to that. I think we need to help parents understand much more about the possibilities that they have, not just to do the therapies that are prescribed, but also to articulate what their goals are, and to help us help them to realize the goals that are meaningful to them. And what we've just published some work. I'm a co-investigator on this paper, but the importance of experience is the raw material for life. When our older daughter was about 4, my wife and I were making an omelet one day, and she said, "Can I crack the eggs?" I mean, come on. What? That wasn't important. She wasn't going to be an omelet chef. It was just something she wanted to accomplish. And it was just a very useful, she's 43, so she's learned. It was just a useful reminder of how important it is for kids to have experiences. Now, if you're a child with a disability, and you can learn to crack the eggs or stir the omelet or whatever, that is part of, that's grist for your mill of becoming a competent person who understands how the world works and how you work. And we need to pay much more attention to this. We also need to pay attention to the difference between capacity and performance. Capacity is what we do at our best. Performance is our ordinary ability, or our ordinary described performance, if you like, ordinary described behavior. If there's a gap between those two, and you know the witticism, if you're so smart, how come you're not rich? I mean, that's an example of that gap. That's sarcastic when we say it to people, but it's important to recognize that if there's a gap between best capacity and performance, we need to try to understand what are the factors that might be inhibiting best performance or best capacity, and what can we do to narrow that gap. And we're now seeing that we should pay attention to all of this and not just to the biomedical parts of people's lives. The final thing I'll say is that we are increasingly aware that we professionals and researchers, and people here do this extremely well, is communicate what we're learning in plain language. And I always go back to Denzel Washington saying to Tom Hanks in Philadelphia, explain it to me like I'm a 5-year-old. It's a real challenge sometimes to say things in plain language, to get the concepts out, but good communicators can do that. I think that our job then is to do knowledge translation, and our job is to be knowledge brokers, to be sharing these ideas. I'm not going to ask who's in the audience tonight, but I would hope that these ideas are being understood by people who run the schools, by people who make policy in the community, by people in the insurance business who understand when we're prescribing things that it isn't just for show, that there are reasons and there are concepts behind our ideas. So everybody understanding these ideas will allow us to have a much fuller and more focused conversation. A couple of quick comments from parents, and we didn't solicit these are sent to us. You will gather information from reports, testing, and individual education plan goals, and this will give you an invaluable insight into my son's needs. For a fuller picture of my awesome child, however, I would like to present you with the following document from my child about my child. So this parent really gets this, the importance of both sides of this picture. I ask parents in clinic when they come in, what do you want to brag about? If you're not going to brag, go home. I don't want to see you. Because we're so busy focusing on what kids can't do that we forget to find out what they can do, what parents are happy about, and to use that information and that enjoyment of the child as a basis for at least some of our work. And a couple of years ago, we had an F.Words panel, and we have a young man. The young man on the left has cerebral palsy. The young woman beside her had a stroke as a 17-year-old. The woman in the blue is a parent of a now 16-year-old with cerebral palsy. And the fourth person, I can't remember who that is. And we had just done a panel on the F-words. And a couple of days later, our colleague, Darcy Failing, sent me this note about a parent who had come to clinic for several years with her child, insisting on lots and lots of therapy. And this parent wrote, spontaneously, my entire approach to raising my son has shifted from one of fixing to a wellness approach by embracing the F-words. I feel very empowered and have reoriented my goals to reflect this paradigm shift. Spontaneous. She was not tortured to say this. It was really important for us to hear that these ideas take root. They may not take root with everybody, and that's okay. But our experience has been, as we've done workshops all over the province and beyond, that parents really like these ideas, and that clinicians like these ideas, and programs are beginning to reshape the whole nature of their program to reflect these concepts, to sit with parents and have them either in an interview or spontaneously to fill out an F-words goal sheet. What are your goals with respect to fitness, function, family, and so on? And why is that an important goal for you right now? And this then changes the discussion from all the impairment part. Without ignoring it, it changes to focusing on these F-words and this approach to health. If you go to our website, you'll find lots of really interesting stuff. And this F-words, the cartoon video, is one that colleagues in Brazil did a couple of years ago, and we liked it so much, it was needless to say, in Portuguese. We said, can we do it in English? And they helped us, and we got a small grant to develop the English version of this. And I want to show you the other one, because I think it's really an interesting example. This is an award-winning
by family physicians,
video
therapists that
made by young people.
Levels work again.
They said anything from she won't walk and talk to she won't be able to live independently.
I wouldn't be able to walk or talk very well.
That I could never go to school and become a master's student.
That I would never be able to do is go on to practice medicine, which has always been my dream.
Researchers have recognized that there are numerous factors that influence the activities and well-being of young people, and that capacity cannot be determined on diagnosis alone. So the World Health Organization developed the International Classification for Functioning Disability in Health. But that's hard to remember, uses medical jargon, and doesn't really seem to apply to me. But the F words, function, family, fitness, fun, friends, and future, they sure do.
Obviously, our condition is a medical condition, and all those things that go into it are very important. We are also people, and we are more than our disabilities.
Function plays a huge part in my life, and it's making decisions about how you want to do things so that you can do the most in a day and how you can participate fully in your life. I think one thing that really needs to be said to everyone is it doesn't matter how you do something, it just matters that you get to do it, and where there's a will, there's a way. They told me that I would never be able to do medicine with one hand, and this year I was able to get into medical school, not only to one, but to 2 medical schools in Ontario, and plan to go on to pursue medicine. I really want to use the F.Words in my practice and make sure that the patients who I'm seeing have the opportunity to live full, happy, and successful lives.
I think it comes down to my family first and foremost. They were a real deciding factor in what I could and couldn't do, because they would defy expectations and pass that on to me. They would make sure that no matter what happened, I would be safe and secure so that I could push the limits of what society had put on me. I would not be where I am without you guys. I love you more than you can possibly know. You never gave up. You were always pushing me to be better than I thought I was.
Fitness is so important to me because I believe that I need and everyone needs to have a healthy physical and mental health. I play sled hockey for my physical and mental well-being. I also work out at the gym. I love it.
Friends are huge in my life, whether it's getting me involved in different activities or being willing to make adaptations or accommodations to how we would normally go out. They've helped me find a different part of myself or a different role for how I see myself. I've got a huge community of people around me who are supporting me, who see beyond what maybe you can't do to see all the things that you can. And there's so many more cans than there are cans. You don't need to place limits on people's opportunity.
My dad got a 3-wheeler and I was really afraid to do it because people make fun of me, but all of my friends like it, so I just started getting used to riding a 3-wheeler. If you're afraid, just tell the other people that you're afraid and just try it. I get to be with my friends, working out and just having some fun and laughing.
I think it's important that we acknowledge that we have a future. I did study journalism and I do freelance, mostly focusing on things related to disability, but I've also been doing a lot of advocacy work. So I hope to continue that into the future and possibly get a master's in public policy. Traveling as much as possible is definitely one of my main personal goals. Maybe I'll get married and have my own kids one day and live a relatively ordinary life in that respect. We are, at the end of the day, just ordinary people like anyone else who have, families and futures and goals and friends and all those things that everyone else has.
And so I really want people to think about the possibilities for people with impairments and never, never, never to limit someone who has a disability because they will prove you wrong every single time.
We all have a story made up of F-words. These are our stories. What's yours?
So the young people made that, these are young people that work with us in an advisory capacity. They made this video entirely on their own and it won an award. So this is what we talked about, what's changing in the world around us, what's changing in our field, and why I think these ideas are important for how we think about disability and impairment. And I'd be very happy for people who have the time, who are able to stay around, to hear your thoughts, your questions, your challenges. I'm open to them, and it's over to you. Thank you very much. thanks,
We've
thanks
got
to
time
Oz.
for a few questions or comments?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I am very excited about the future of extra gaming and multi-user games and the future of the virtual classroom and its potential in the field of disability. But you talk a lot about participation and experiences, and I wonder, what are your thoughts if that participation and those experiences are happening alone in your bedroom, but you are playing and interacting and making friends?
Yeah, I think you raise a really good point. Some of you know that I'm not on Facebook, and I'm not a tweeter or whatever one is. In part because I think the point you raise is so important. You can have so-called friends and so-called likes, or you can have a conversation like the two of us are having right now. And we were talking at dinner last night with Stephanie about the fact that she's been in a restaurant where two people are sitting across the table from one another, texting each other. And that to me is just quite bizarre. So I think that the value of these things is the opportunity, obviously, to meet and connect with people anywhere. But that isn't, to me, a substitute for face-to-face interaction and opportunities to actually have conversation in real time with sound and fury, and not just tweets and internet stuff. I think we need both, but we must not see one as a substitute for the other. Thank you.
Peter, if I could ask you,
Yeah.
You've done a lot of research in how peers and family see those that are facing a challenge and so forth. So my question is about how people with challenges see and need other people with challenges. And I guess it's the question that's been around for a long time in terms of allocation of resources. Is there value to invest in resources to take people with challenges and have them together and interacting, or is there greater value in disseminating and integrating people with challenges just into the general community like everybody else? Or is there something to be learned and gained from appreciating the challenges of others when you have your own challenges?
Yeah, the answer is yes. What I mean is that in 1973 there was a book written by some colleagues in the UK called The Disabled School Child, and they explored a range of 7 options for kids, and this is now 45 years ago, 7 options for kids with special needs, which included anything from full integration to full segregation. And one of the points they made, which I suspect they would still endorse, at least the author who's still alive would still endorse, is it really depends upon what your particular needs and issues are. I like to remind people that we often have, I don't know whether you have in a small community like this, but in big cities there are often magnet schools. So there's a school for the arts, or there's an athletic school where you do all your academics in the morning and you spend all your afternoons training. Those are segregated or specialized programs. So the question would be, what does this particular person need, and how can those needs be best addressed? And it might be different models at different ages. The idea, and I'm not saying that this is what you said, but I'll caricature what you said, that they should all be together with their own kind, is one point of view that has been around in the past, and it's kind of being kind to them. I think that's a silly idea. If we have the opportunity to find out what people want to do, what their needs are, how we can best address their needs, that might be in an integrated class, it might be in a segregated class. It also depends what resources you have in the community. But I don't think there should be a particular formulaic approach to this based on some philosophy. Yes, sir.
Bert?
Oh, sorry.
As a comment, after a lifetime of research, what I really like is that basically you've come around to what is plain common sense.
That's, I said my dad used to say, why do you need research for this?
It's not only for a child. I mean, I was injured 10 years ago, a spinal cord injury. Been Cheryl 10 years ago. For a year, intensive therapy, they're all trying to get me to a goal of whatever normal is. I said, the hell with that, I want to live my life. And I made more gains
Yep.
getting back into that, although the transition of being helped was useful.
Yep.
The gains are made when you go out and live a full life.
Thank you. You make a really important point about the difference between rehabilitation, which is what you were offered, and what I want after my stroke, and the interventions that we do in kids. We call it pediatric rehabilitation. I think it's the wrong name, because you were able to decide, first of all, you had a history of what you could do before your injury. You were also able to make decisions about what was important to you from the menu of options that you had available. And the choices that you've made were informed by your understanding of yourself and your life and your wishes. When we're talking about kids, our default has been normal development, and I'm arguing that we shouldn't think about it as normal development. We should think about it as development in the context of that child, that family, those interests, those capabilities, and so on. But I don't think we should call it rehabilitation. I think we should focus on development, because that's a very different approach to things than what you described, and I thank you for that comment.
So you spoke about like hopes for the changing, like hopes to shape things in the future.
Yeah.
So I was wondering in your career, like what is one hope that you've been able to see realized, and what is one hope that you have?
Oh man. I think we're seeing a major shift in thinking, and I would claim to be a participant in that shift. I've had the opportunity to lecture all over the world, and as my wife says, I give my talk. But when I'm invited to talk, I ask people what they want to hear, and if they want to hear something about how the field is shifting, I try to give a variation of this talk with an understanding of what are the issues in your community. Since you've invited me to come and talk in Brazil or in the Republic of Georgia or whatever, what is it that you think the people who you're going to invite to the meeting need to hear, and try to inflect what I'm saying to their understanding of things, and recognizing that in different countries the situations and the resources and the thinking are very different. I was in Georgia in May, Republic of, as opposed to the one down the road. And that's the other, it's just south of Russia. And they said, we want to get out from under Soviet influence because they had been dominated by a very powerful negative approach to disability. And they were essentially starting fresh. And so it was very easy to put these ideas forward and to have a huge embrace of these ideas. So that's something I think has been very exciting. A challenge which the Ramis and I were talking about, and other people have talked about, is how do we get these ideas into the heads and minds and hearts of medical students, physio students, nursing students, and so on. So the next generation coming along of health professionals thinks differently and talks differently, and doesn't see disability as defeat, and doesn't see disability as terribly sad, and what can you do for them? And that's a challenge that we're fighting at McMaster right now, where we have a large number of medical students, nursing students, OTs, physios, speech therapists, midwives, and we're trying very hard to get the whole Faculty of Health Sciences to bring in a theme of the International Classification of Functioning framework as a lens through which all of the teaching can be done. Because if we had everybody in the community understanding this thinking, then we'd have a much better frame of communication than we do now. That's a bit of work still to do.
Yeah, we have time for one last, well,
Sir.
I think she had her hand up.
Reduce this down,
Yep.
and yet you say we're trying to get it done. What's the force against you in the school?
Inertia, we already know this, we already do this. One of the comments from the, we met with the education committee of the faculty, and the speech therapist said, we're totally with this. Our whole program, which started 2 years ago, is built around the ICF. Surprisingly, the occupational therapist said, we teach theories, not frameworks. In other words, piss off. Which we weren't too happy with that. Other people just kind of looked at us blankly. The man who is the head of the undergraduate medical education program, whom I know a little bit, was very responsive to three of us coming with our new book, which is coming out at the end of the year on the ICF, and making a presentation in which we will try to illustrate with some of the issues and the biomedical problems that are being used now. Here's how this problem, without changing anything, could be taught differently. We're trying to illustrate. It's mostly inertia.
Question?
Thank you, Dr. Rosenbaum, for your talk. I'm a pediatric physical therapist, and you justified my sometimes unorthodox approach to my practice with my kids. In my retirement, though, I recently retired early in order to start a nonprofit organization to meet the needs of these families and their children for adaptive and mobility equipment that they were not getting sufficiently from insurance. We take secondhand equipment, refurbish it, and give it away free. We're only 4 years old in Virginia, and we have served 1,500 kids already. And so I'm kind of challenging this audience here that came to hear you talk, that did you know that it weren't for this organization, there'd be kids in Virginia that can't go to school because they don't have a way to get there. They don't have a wheelchair that fits them. And this is some changes that need to happen.
Yeah.
And I wanted to have the opportunity to kind of pull your audience into, because they came to hear you, that there is still a problem here. And as a physical therapist, this adaptive and mobility equipment is what allows kids with disability to meet the challenges, allow them to do the things that they want to do. And it's really hard for them to get these things, and we need to make a change that.
So I make two quick comments. That's a very powerful comment about the role of environment, in this case, a technical environment, i.e. a wheelchair, and the political environment and the financial environment, which make this difficult to do. But here are kids who still probably need therapy, and this is not against therapy, but it is to say that the wheels literally empower these kids to go to school. And it's crazy that we even have to say that. But so it's worth thinking about the many ways in which we can be helpful, while also running for your school council and making fusses about these things. Thank you very much.
One last question right there.
So talking about the political environment, you said earlier that the adult world is not nearly as forgiving or as integrated as the child world in the school system. So what do you think is the most important thing to do socially moving forward?
How long have I got? I think that it's really important that we talk to students, to medical students, nursing students, physical therapy students, social work students, and so on, about huge opportunities to have a huge impact on the lives of people in the community who have impairments, and on their families, and on the community at large, if we can figure out how to get our act together. I think that both in your country and in our country, although we have quite different medical systems, there's no particular incentive for anybody in the adult world to be interested in people with disabilities beyond, whether their pain is caused by their cerebral palsy, in which case we give them a treatment or two. We really need, as somebody said, we need more pediatricians for adults. We need a system that is much more interested in the life course of people who used to be children and who haven't been cured and who don't want to be cured, who want to have equal opportunities for employment, for accommodation, for access to the community and so on. And I don't have easy answers, but we really have to be making this point. We also, the last thing I'll say is we need to be talking to parents about thinking about a life course, thinking about, in addition to whatever we're going to do this week or this month, where do you want your child to go? What do you want your child to be able to do? And think life course even from early on. And the lessons we're learning from adults with disabilities, and the study I referred to earlier, are things that we can feed back into what we're doing with parents of kids who are 2 and 3 and 4 and 5. But it's a very thorny issue for which I don't think there's an easy answer. If anybody has the answer, I'm happy to hear it. I'll wait around.
Please join me in thanking Dr. Rosenbaum.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. You